Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, and welcome to my Legion Unholy Death Knight guide. This is a new series that I'm starting at where I go over the core gameplay of each class and spec in the Legion Alpha, and sort of give you an overview of how they're played and how their core mechanics work. Like I said, in this video we'll be going over the Unholy Death Knight. Unholy is getting a pretty big revamp for Legion. So far this expansion seems to be trying to separate each of the class specs from each other to make them feel more unique. This spec has more of a focus on undead minions and diseases more so than it does in Draenor, and it sort of plays into the whole undead plague lord theme a little more. Keep in mind that this is all alpha gameplay, so things that you like or don't like are always subject to change. The core gameplay of Unholy is centered around the debuff Festering Wound. This is applied by a few different abilities which I'll go over later. This is a debuff that you stack on your enemy and you can trigger it to pop for a certain amount of damage. Basically, you have some abilities that stack Festering Wounds, and some abilities that pop them. The debuff itself can stack up to 8 times as of this alpha build, so there's a lot of burst potential here if you build up a bunch of stacks and then you pop them all really quickly. You'll be managing these stacks along with your runes and runic power. The runes themselves are different in Legion. Instead of having Unholy, Frost, or Blood runes, you just have 6 Death runes now, and of course abilities that required Blood, Unholy, or Frost runes are now switched over to Death runes. Presences are also gone. It looks like you can no longer switch between Frost, Blood, or Unholy presence for their different bonuses. A lot of spells have been changed, removed, or added. I'll go over all of them one by one in the spell book, and I'll also show them all in action so you can get a good idea of how the spec works to see if you would like it or not. I'll sort of go over these in order of importance, putting higher priority on the bread and butter abilities that make up the core of the Unholy spec. And at the end of the video, I'll show you some real fights and narrate them a bit so you can see how all of this comes together. First up, we have Festering Strike. This is how you're going to build up your Festering Wounds. This costs 2 runes, deals some heavy physical damage, and builds up anywhere from 1 to 4 Festering Wound stacks. It also generates 20 runic power. Next up is Scourge Strike, which also saw an overhaul. This does a mix of physical and shadow damage and also triggers a single Festering Wound. This is going to be one of the ways you pop your Festering Wounds. Obviously, this is something you only want to use if you have Festering Wounds on your target, or else it's going to be pretty weak. This generates 15 runic power if you pop a Festering Wound, and 10 without. Death Strike is now a runic power spender. This used to cost 1 Unholy and Frost Rune each. Now it costs 40 runic power. The heal is changed as well. It used to give you a flat heal depending on your gear. Now it just heals you for 20% of the damage you took in the last 6 seconds, with a minimum of 7% of your total life. Comparing it to Draenor, it does feel weaker. Just the heal itself is less, and because it costs runic power, it's something you can't use right away if you get into a tight spot. When it costed runes, you could just throw off a few of these immediately to get your health back up. But now you have to build up the runic power first, so you may have to throw in a few Festering Strikes or Scourge Strikes, which waste precious seconds. But like I said, it is alpha, so who knows if it'll stay like that or not. Death Coil is your other runic power spender. This costs 30 runic power and has a 30-yard range and deals some light shadow damage. You can no longer heal undead minions with it. Instead, when you deal damage with it, it restores 10 energy to your ghoul. So this is the more offensive runic power spender compared to Death Strike, which is more on the defensive side. Raise Dead still summons your ghoul, still an infinite duration with a 1-minute cooldown, and the Claw and Leap abilities are the same. Claw does 125% damage and Leap leaps behind the target. Nod did see a pretty big nerf. In Draenor it's a 3-second stun with a 1-minute cooldown. On Legion it's a 1-second stun with a 1.5-minute cooldown. Dark Transformation is a little different. It no longer takes charges of Shadow Infusion. Instead, it's just a DPS cooldown. It has a duration of 20 seconds with a cooldown of 1 minute. All of the Dark Transformation abilities are the same once again, with the exception of Na, which is increased to 2 seconds instead of 4. Outbreak got an overhaul. Instead of applying Blood Plague and Frost Fever, it now applies the single Virulent Plague. This is a damage over time ability that explodes for bonus damage when afflicted enemies die. The target hit by Outbreak spreads the Virulent Plague to itself and all nearby enemies. Every tick has a 30% chance to trigger the on-death explosion, so this is going to be a big source of your AoE damage. It is important to note, however, that the explosion damage is split evenly between enemies. It costs 1 rune and has a 6-second cooldown, so this is something you're going to want to keep up on each fight. Death and Decay is still the same with the exception of a pretty sick addition. While you remain within the Death and Decay, your Scourge Strike will attack all nearby enemies. If a nearby enemy has festering wounds on them, this also pops a stack, so this is a huge source of AoE damage. Your big DPS cooldown is still Summon Gargoyle. This is pretty much the same with a 3-minute cooldown and a 40-second duration. Rune Forging saw a little streamlining. Runes of Lich Bane, Spell Breaking, and Spell Shattering are all gone. You only have Razor Ice, Fallen Crusader, and Stone Skin Gargoyle, which have the same effects as they do in Draenor. Other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. Maybe some small stuff is different, like cooldowns or slight damage changes and whatnot. Other abilities that I haven't mentioned yet that are all pretty much the same are Mind Freeze, Path of Frost, Raise Ally, Anti-Magic Shell, Army of the Dead, Chains of Ice, Control Undead, Death Gate, Death Grip, and Icebound Fortitude. Feel free to pause the video on any of those if you want to see them in full detail, because some of them have very minor differences. For passives, we still have Dark Succor, the Dreadblade Unholy Mastery, On a Pale Horse, and Sudden Doom. Those are all pretty much the same. New passives are Death's Advance, which used to be a talent actually. This just gives you a passive 50% movement speed boost now. And also Runic Corruption got moved from talents to passives for Unholy. It now only has a 1.25% chance per runic power spent to gain 100% rune regeneration, as opposed to Draenor's 1.5% chance. And that's every ability and passive. If I didn't list anything from Draenor, it was either removed to talents, removed entirely, or they just haven't put it back yet. Next up, I'll go over the revamped talents. Here we have our talent tree. I'll have a link to a talent calculator in the description if you want to see for yourself. But in the level 56 tier, we have All Will Serve. This removes a 1-minute cooldown on your Raise Dead ability, and it gives you another skeleton minion to fight alongside you. You can't control the minion itself. It's sort of like an Army of the Dead minion where it just attacks whatever you attack. Next we have Bursting Sores. This causes your festering wounds to deal 20% of its damage to all nearby enemies when you burst it. Just to boost the AoE damage, this can be really deadly if you combine it with the effect from Death and Decay. It makes for some really strong AoE damage if you have that going along with your Virulent Plague as well. And finally, for the level 56 tier, we have Ebon Fever. This makes your Virulent Plague deal its damage 50% more frequently, so it just makes that a little stronger. For the level 57 tier, we have Infected Claws. This gives your Ghoul's Claw ability a 50% chance to apply a festering wound to its target. If you take this talent, Death Coil starts to become really strong because, like I showed earlier, it restores energy to your ghoul when it hits. Next we have Pestilent Pustules, which cause your Festering Strike to apply 1 to 6 stacks of festering wounds as opposed to its base 1 to 4. And we have Blighted Rune Weapon. This causes your next 3 auto attacks to apply 2 festering wounds each. This has a 30-second duration with a 1-minute cooldown. Pretty handy tier overall. It is nice to have multiple ways to apply festering wounds so you're not pigeonholed into solely using Festering Strike. For the level 58 tier, we have Unholy Frenzy. Whenever you burst a festering wound, your ghoul gains a 100% increase to attack speed for 2 seconds. This doesn't stack at all, so if you pop more than one within 2 seconds, it just adds to the duration. You also have Castigator. This causes your Scourge Strike critical strikes to pop 2 festering wounds instead of 1, and you also get a bonus 3 runic power. For the third choice, we have Clawing Shadows. This replaces Scourge Strike. It has a 30-yard range as opposed to Scourge Strike's melee range, and its damage is all shadow as opposed to a mix of physical and shadow. For the level 60 tier, we have Sludge Belcher. This replaces your ghoul with a stronger Abomination. Its abilities are Cleaver, similar to Claw, except its Dark Transformation is an AoE gas explosion. It also has Protective Bile. This is a shield wall that prevents 50% damage for 10 seconds and 60% while in Dark Transformation. It also has Hook, which is basically another Death Grip. If the target is immune, the Abomination pulls himself to the target instead, and it also roots the target for 2 seconds if the Abomination is in Dark Transformation. And it also has Smash, which is a mirror of Na. Next we have Asphyxiate, which has seen a pretty big nerf. This stuns the target for 6 seconds now, but it's channeled so you can't do anything while you're channeling it. It also has a whopping 2-minute cooldown now, up from 30 seconds in Draenor. You can, however, move while channeling it. It seems in general, stuns and crowd control are getting big nerfs across the board for most classes in Legion. Next up we have Debilitating Infestation, which causes all enemies affected by your outbreak to be slowed by 50% for 3 seconds. Just a nice AoE slow to have. For the level 75 tier we have Corpse Shield. This is a big shield wall that transfers 90% of the damage that you take to your ghoul for the next 10 seconds. If your ghoul dies, it's out of the fight for 30 seconds though, so it does come at a cost. Unfortunately, this one wasn't implemented in the build I was playing, so I can't show you this one in action. Next we have Spell Eater. This makes your anti-magic shell absorb 20% more damage and last 5 seconds longer, bringing it to a whopping 10 seconds. And we also have Death's Flight, which replaces your Death Grip. This instead pulls yourself to a friendly player or pet, but it has a cooldown of 1.5 minutes, as opposed to Death Grip's 20-second cooldown. For the level 90 tier we have Shadow Infusion. This causes your Death Coil to decrease the cooldown of Dark Transformation by 2 seconds. Dark Transformation already has a duration of 20 seconds and a cooldown of 1 minute, so taking this one will make it so you have very little downtime on it if you're spamming Death Coil a lot. Next up is Necrosis, which makes your Death Coil have a 25% chance to trigger a virulent plague eruption when you deal damage with it. And we have Profane Pathogens, which costs 2 runes and causes all of your virulent plague effects to instantly erupt. This is a big increase to your AoE damage, although the 2 rune cost is pretty hefty. Finally, for the level 100 tier, we have the Dark Arbiter. This replaces your Gargoyle. Instead, it summons a Valkyr that gets more and more powerful as you spend runic power. We still have Defile. This replaces Death and Decay, and just like in Draenor, it gets stronger and bigger with each tick, but now it also pops a Festering Wound with each tick as well. It costs 1 rune and has a 30-second cooldown just like Death and Decay, but you also lose the AoE Scourge Strike effect that Death and Decay has. And lastly we have Soul Reaper. This got an overhaul as well. This now pops 3 stacks of Festering Wounds after a 5-second delay after using it, and it gives you Runic Corruption, which increases your rune regeneration rate by 100%. This costs 1 rune and has a 30-second cooldown. So pretty varied choices, lots of choices between single target damage, AoE damage, and utility. I personally like how a lot of these talents buff your pets. Having a formidable undead minion is sort of the essence of the Unholy Death Knight in my opinion, so it'll be interesting experimenting with those different combinations. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the artifact for the Unholy Death Knight, and that's the Apocalypse Sword. This artifact has an ability itself. It's a 40-yard range, 1.7 second cast that deals some heavy damage and adds 3 stacks of Festering Wounds, and it has a cooldown of 45 seconds. Just another source of Festering Wounds. It's nice to have because it doesn't cost any runes or runic powers, so this is something you can use when you're empty on everything to minimize downtime. It also makes for a good opener as well due to its long range. All of these artifacts have these various passives you can unlock. There are calculators for this all over the place. I'll have a link in the description, but I'll go over the major ones here. First up we have Flagellation. This makes enemies hit by Death Coil take an extra 50% damage from Scourge Strike. So once again, kind of reinforcing Death Coil as the offensive runic power spender. You also have Double Doom, which causes your Sudden Doom to stack up to 2 times and proc 25% more frequently. Sudden Doom, if you recall, is the passive that gives your auto attacks a chance to give you a free Death Coil. And you also have the Shambler, which gives your attacks a chance to summon an exploding super zombie. The rest of these are pretty generic, some interesting stuff, but mainly just percentage increases to abilities and such. I'll mouse over these quickly and you can pause the video if you want to read them, and like I said, I'll have a link to the calculator in the description if you want to check that out. You don't have to choose between any of these traits, you'll be able to get them all eventually. You just need to get enough artifact power, which you'll get by questing, PvPing, raiding, and so on. And that's it for all of the abilities and passives and such. At least for this alpha build anyways. I'm sure they'll add more or change some stuff later on, but that's okay because the purpose of this video is just to give you a basic idea of how the spec is played, and that's something that's very unlikely to change as they update the game. Now let's put this all together. We got quite the arsenal here. The only way to get an idea of how the spec is played is to see it in action, so I'll show you some basic fights here and narrate them a bit. Here are some quick single target fights. As you can see here, I'm opening with my Virulent Plague, and following that up with a Soul Reaper. Remember that Soul Reaper consumes 3 stacks of Festering Wounds, so you gotta get those up before it pops. In general, by the time Soul Reaper triggers, you want to try to have empty runes to get the maximum benefit of the Runic Corruption, and you want to have low runic power so you don't cap right away and waste some damage. I love the new Soul Reaper because you can set up some really good burst. If you use it when you have 8 Festering Wounds up, you can follow it up with a mix of 5 Scourge Strikes and a few Death Coils due to that Runic Corruption proc. I think it's going to be a must-have for PvP with the way it works now. Other than that, it's just going to be a battle of managing your Festering Wounds, Virulent Plague, Runes, and Runic Power. Obviously, you never want to cap out on Runic Power, and you don't want to have too many active runes waiting to be spent if you want to maximize your damage. As it stands right now, there's very little downtime. It's pretty rare that you'll find yourself in the situation of having no Runic Power or runes. Even still, you have the Apocalypse ability to kind of act as a filler for that. And here's some AoE fights for you. Like you saw in the talents, there are a lot of different options available to you. I personally like throwing up my Virulent Plague, getting Festering Wounds up on everything, and then using Defile to pop them all. And from there, just spamming some Profane Pathogens for that Virulent Plague burst. If I have the Abomination, I also like to use Dark Transformation because he gets that AoE effect. And finally, here's a longer single target fight. Busting out some cooldowns for this one. Dark Transformation is something I like to use on cooldown because it's so short. Summon Gargoyle and Army of the Dead are things I generally save for big fights like this since they have longer cooldowns. Once again, it's just a matter of keeping track of your runes and runic power and so on. If you do things correctly, you can set up some really good burst as Unholy. I can't wait to try the spec out in PvP because I think it's going to be really powerful. And that's basically it. Hopefully now you have a better basic understanding of how this spec works. If you want to see more Unholy gameplay, I also did a full dungeon run. No commentary on that though, just some raw gameplay for those of you who want to see more of what this spec is capable of. I'll have an annotation for that right here and a link in the description if you want to see that. I personally love the direction that they're going with for Unholy. It feels like the first time in a long time that you actually feel unholy, if you know what I mean. The combination of diseases and undead pets is really cool in my opinion, and I'll probably be leveling as this spec once Legion releases. Anyway, thanks for checking out the video. I'll be doing guides like this for every spec and every class in the game, so keep an eye out for those if you're interested. If you have any feedback or suggestions, feel free to leave me a message. This is my very first Legion class guide, so I'm sure there's a ton of room for improvement. I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope you had a lot of fun watching it. I hope you found it helpful. Give it a like if you liked it, and if you really liked it, let me know in the comments and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching, good luck, and peace!